Hello, welcome back to another episode of Economics with Mr. Cole. And today, as promised, I will continue with behavioral economics. And if you haven't seen the first part of this 4-part series, please click on the link in the information section. And as mentioned, we're still at the first bullet point. What are the limitations of consumer rational choice theory? In the first part, I went over imperfect information, as well as some cognitive biases, more generally speaking, the biased use of information under bounded rationality. And these, characteristics or sort of imperfections are what cause behavioral economists to think that rational decision making by consumers is unrealistic. Now, in this video, we are still at bounded rationality, and I'll go over the second general form of cognitive bias called loss aversion. So this means that people have got a reference point and they would quote outcomes against this reference point. So it will be a gain, relatively speaking, as compared to this reference point, it will be perceived as a gain. Or relative to this reference point, the same one, it will be perceived as a loss. So loss aversion basically predicts that losses are disliked more than would be predicted by standard diminishing marginal utility theory. And the first form of loss aversion is the endowment effect. And this means that people ascribe different values depending on whether they already own the item or not. So it's a case of ownership versus non-ownership. It may also extend to psychological attachment. So for example, this really, gorgeous designer handbag from Gucci. And I'm going to use the utility function of a hypothetical character, Sarah, to illustrate the endowment effect. So the y-axis is Sarah's utility, and recall that consumers in traditional theory aim to maximize utility. And the x-axis is the quantity of handbags that she owns. So in the first case, Sarah did not initially own a handbag, so she's at point A. After purchasing one, the gain in utility would be from 0 to U1. All right, so once purchased, there will be a new reference point, point B. However, in the second case, in which Sarah already owns a handbag, she might sell it, okay? But if she sells it, this endowment effect has sort of, kicked in, so to speak, and there is going to be a fall in utility that's much greater than expected, okay? So it won't fall to 0, but fall to UL, which means it's negative actually, because UL is smaller than 0. And that means that Sarah does not, or, greatly does not like or dislikes a loss once she already owns the item, right? So this is an example of the endowment effect, and it basically implies that Sarah is loss averse, right? Next, we've got the sunk cost fallacy, also under loss aversion. Right? Some costs are costs that cannot be recovered. Right. So an economic agent earlier invested resources, time, money, even, cognitive efforts on a historical decision, and continues to let this unrecoverable cost influence their present decision making, even though its marginal benefit may be less than its marginal cost. So it's not rational typically to think about some costs because they can't be recovered anyway. So one example would be the very famous espresso coffee machine, right? I have already bought this coffee machine, so I should continue replenishing the coffee capsules, even though the consumer may not like coffee drinking that much anymore, right? So it may not be rational to continue making a purchase of, the coffee capsules. In fact, it may be more rational to sell the coffee machine to someone else as a second-hand product, right? So there's no point crying over spilled milk, or in this case, spilled coffee. All right. Finally, also under loss aversion, we've got status quo bias. This refers to behavioral inertia that reduces people's penchant or desire for change, as well as the extra effort required to opt out of a choice. Consumers may be averse to the loss of the current default option. So, for example, in Singapore, we've got the telco company, right? Simba, which charges relatively low rates for, a line subscription. And the consumer might think that for my mobile phone number, I currently subscribe to another brand, right? Telco brand X, and will not switch to the cheaper option, Simba, even though they both offer similar services. So in this case, it's not really rational to stay with the more expensive telco subscription, and we would consider this as a form of status quo bias. All right, so that's basically it for bounded rationality. Right now, I'm moving on to another imperfection that consumers might have: bounded willpower or self-control. Okay, so in reality, consumers often do not stop consuming even when it is sensible or more optimal or more rational to stop. They consume even though the price of the good or service is greater than the marginal utility from consumption. For example, consumers might face difficulty in delaying gratification and would rather indulge in short-term rewards, right? So, this chocolate cake example is perfect to illustrate this. Earlier, I planned to go on a diet, right? That's me all the time. But I'll still eat the slice of chocolate cake now, right? Even though health concerns and future medical fees should discourage current consumption. So what can I say? I have bounded willpower. I'm not going to lie, right? So I'm always down for a good slice of chocolate cake. Well, present bias helps explain why many people have difficulty in sticking to commitments, right? So consumers would, attach more importance to what's happening in the here and now, basically. Right. So discipline and hard work often pay off after some time, but laziness pays off now. But I just have to remind my students, please don't be lazy. Please work hard. You would need to put in the effort to see the results, especially at the A levels and IB. And last but not least, we've got bounded self-interest and selfishness. Right. So people may not, or rather may act on behalf of the well-being of others, not only themselves. For example, agents might act due to perceived moral grounds, social norms, even when that comes at some risk of a net loss in utility. So, for example, in cost-benefit analysis, one would think that, hey, I shouldn't be running into the burning building to save a stranger. I don't know this person, but there might be, and I'm sure the philosophy majors are going to be more helpful this time on explaining, values, moral judgments, etc., etc. So basically, definitely there is bounded self-interest here. In economics, it would typically be more rational to stay out of the fires, right? So what this means is that we start by looking at the effect of our consumption or our actions on other people, right? One's utility is not just a function of oneself, but also others' utilities and payoffs. So, for example, in altruism, so a person may display altruistic behavior, right? And that means being willing to increase the payoffs to others at personal cost to yourself. For instance, making donations to a charity or having spiteful preferences. Okay, and that means being willing to reduce the payoffs of others at a personal cost, almost retributionist, right? So there is this concept of reciprocity, which means that people's behavior is influenced by its effects on others. So people may experience an increase in their own utility, right, by being kind to others, as they believe that the other people have been kind to them, or their utility may increase if they are unkind to people that they believe have been unkind to them. So a bit of a tit for tat kind of mentality. Right. I'm going to go over giving behavior because this is quite a significant topic in H3 economics, higher 3 economics in the Singapore's version of the A levels. And it may be a potential IB higher level extended essay topic. So altruistic and non-altruistic reasons behind giving behavior. As I've mentioned, there is a willingness to increase the payoffs to others at a personal cost to yourself, for example, out of moral reasons. But At the same time, there are also non-altruistic intentions. For example, there could be a gain to yourself that people might not immediately realize. So, for example, if you make a donation, there could be increased publicity for your charitable act, and that could lead to, a lot of benefits that come in your way. So that's considered a personal gain. So if the expected net benefit is greater than zero, then this would fit the classical view of rational decision making. So it's not actually contradicting classical theory at all. All right. So just a recap, that behavioral economists assert that, rational decision making by consumers is unrealistic because classical economic thought assumes the following, which may not be the case in reality. And yes, that's the summary of what we've gone over in this video, the part 2 of the 4-part series, as well as the previous video, right? So we've finished, the imperfections that consumers may experience, therefore being unable to engage in rational decision making. But the list that I showed you in the previous slide was not exhaustive. Okay, and again, please check your own syllabus guide, your syllabus document, on what exactly you need to know, because there's slight differences between, for example, the A levels and the IB. So you might not need to know everything in that list, right? And there are, I'm sure, many other imperfections or cognitive biases that consumers might have. So I'm just going to give another example: herd and groupthink, right? So that also influences consumers' behavior. And you might want to try to recall when was the last time you followed the crowd, right? And a few exam style questions. If you distinguish between the classical view and the behavioral view of decision making by economic agents, 10 marks. Using relevant examples, explain how cognitive biases influence consumers in buying decisions. 10 marks as well. And if you're doing the Singapore's version of the A-levels Higher 3, this is very good essay question to practice. Discuss the extent to which rational decision-making necessarily entails economic agents acting selfishly, and whether giving behavior may be considered rational. 35 marks. Right. In the next 2 videos, we will be applying our knowledge of behavioral insights regarding consumers. So we're going to be answering a central question: how might firms and governments apply knowledge of consumers' cognitive biases in their strategies and policies? As well as how can government nudge its citizens to make better choices? All right, so that's it for today. Thank you very much. Goodbye.